Hi there gamers, I'm the Lights, and today I'll be teaching you how to Arcstrider. If there's one build in particular you're interested in and you just want to skip to the points and learn about the choices we make with a specific build and why, or you just want to know what to equip so you can get to playing, I'll have everything chaptered out so you can jump right to it. Anyway, let's get started. 100% serious. I think Arcstrider has higher slaying potential than any other subclass in the entire game. There are a few that come close, and some that definitely do it more safely. But in terms of potential for raw output, I don't think any other subclass compares to the Arc Hunter. So let's break down the abilities. For supers, we've got two at the moment to choose from, those being Gathering Storm and Arc Staff. If you didn't play Destiny much last year, you might not be familiar with Gathering Storm, so we'll start there. Gathering Storm is a one and done super where you hurl your Arc Staff, which will either embed itself in a larger target or embed itself in the ground. The impact of the staff will jolt everything around it and then get struck by lightning, dealing hefty amounts of damage to anything around it. Then it'll deal damage over time for the next few seconds. This super is right up there with the other big hunter damage supers in terms of output, but since a lot of the damage is done through the damage over time effect afterwards, it is equally potent to supers like Blade Barrage for boss DPS, but a little less so for pure burst damage. The next super is Arc Staff, which is a roaming super where you wield your Arc Staff. You can do heavy attacks, light attacks, spam your dodge, and block to reflect damage back at enemies. For our class ability, we have the usual choice of Marksman's Dodge or Gambler's Dodge. Marksman's Dodge reloads the gun you have out and has a 29-second base cooldown. Gambler's Dodge has a 38-second base cooldown and the ability to refresh your melee abilities cooldown when used near an enemy. The two melee abilities you could potentially refresh using Gambler's Dodge are Disorienting Blow and Combination Blow. Disorienting Blow is just a punch that blinds the target you hit and makes you amplified. Combination Blow, on the other hand, is largely the cornerstone of the Arc Hunter in PvE. For all intents and purposes, the functionality of this melee at base is just a normal punch, but when you kill an enemy with Combination Blow, you regain health, refund the cooldown of your dodge, and gain a buff that increases your next melee attack's damage that'll stack up to 3 times, and at 3 stacks, this is a 256% melee damage increase to any melee damage you deal while the buff is active. This buff will increase the damage of even uncharged melee attacks, like I said, but it will require a kill from a charged melee to trigger the health regen and to either refresh the buff or gain further stacks of the buff. This melee ability combined with Gambler's Dodge is on its own a self-sustaining loop where you're using your melee ability to refund your dodge cooldown and your dodge to refund your melee cooldown. And this loop is the crux of most Arc Hunter builds. Quickly to mention Jump, we have one extra option here, that being Blink, which is pretty great for just general gameplay. It is fun to use, but I personally don't opt to run it more often than not just because I'm not very good at using it. For grenades, we have quite a few options, and to list them all really quick, we have Arc Bolt, Flashbang, Flux, Lightning, Pulse, Skip, and Storm grenades. You can try any of the grenades you want though, and go with the one that you think will work best for you with pretty much all of the builds that we'll be talking about. For aspects, we have 3 choices, those being Flow State, Tempest Strike, and Lethal Current. One you are likely to never take off is Flow State. Flow State states that defeating a jolted opponent causes you to become amplified. While amplified, your dodge recharges faster, you gain damage resistance while dodging, and the reload speed of all of your weapons is greatly increased. To put some numbers to this is a 200% buff to our dodge regeneration, a 97% damage resistance buff while we're dodging, 55 reload speed with a 0.87 duration scaler. So that is really strong if you can't already tell. But also, this is all under the condition that we are amplified, and we haven't talked about exactly what being amplified means or how we get it outside of this fragment. All Arc subclasses can become amplified, either by getting rapid final blows with Arc weapons or abilities, or through a subclass aspect. In this case for Hunter, of course, it's Flow State. For Warlocks, they get Electrostatic Mind, and for Titans, they get Knockout. While amplified at a baseline, all of your weapons gain cranked handling, you can slide further, and while sprinting for a little bit, you can activate Speed Booster, which increases your movement speed and initial jump height, as well as giving you damage resistance. To get a little more specific, this buff gives you 40 handling with a 0.96 duration scaler, 50 mobility, and increases your slide distance by a third. The mobility stat, keep in mind, only affects strafe speed, initial jump height, and importantly for us, dodge cooldown. That increase to sprint speed will come in once Speed Booster is active. It's a 12.5% increase to your sprint speed. The damage resistance is 15% in PvE. And then the jump height increases double, but that'll only be your initial jump. It won't improve the functionality of things like triple jump. This buff also does not stack with movement exotics like Stompies, which is a little limp, but it is what it is, and it is still really fun. And then there was another arc keyword in the flow state definition that we haven't talked about yet, and that is Jolt. Jolt, boiled down, is a debuff you apply to enemies that isn't all that unlike Strand's Unravel or Void's Volatile, if you're familiar with either of those. It is, however, quite a lot more potent than both of those. A jolted target will take further instances of damage after having damage dealt to them, and will emit lightning strikes to nearby enemies once these instances are triggered. The damage of the Jolt activations actually also scale with the damage of whatever applied it. So for example, a Jolt debuff from our Gathering Storm super is going to do quite a lot more damage than Jolt applied by a submachine gun. Jolting also stuns Overload champions now, so that's pretty cool. Jolt procs have a 1.3 second internal cooldown and are actually quite complex, so that is all we're going to do with Jolt for now, but let me know if you want me to go into more depth on Jolt and other similar debuffs in the future with a separate video by leaving a comment. Our next aspect is Tempest Strike, which is basically a waveframe GL shot in effect. And this is triggered by performing a slide followed by your melee input, and this is an attack that will also apply Jolt. It does not share a lot of the same functionality as your melee. For example, if you have Combination Blow as your base melee, getting kills with this won't stack Combination Blow. It won't blind if you're on Disorienting Blow. Lethal Current is the final aspect and states that after dodging, your melee lunge range is increased and will jolt and trigger a lightning aftershock. You can think of it more like it applies jolt and triggers jolt. That is aside from the fact that the lightning aftershock counts as a separate instance of damage from your melee ability for the purposes of stacking Combination Blow. It does, however, count as a melee ability and melee damage for basically everything else, like Grave Robber and Assassin's Cowl. Additionally, hitting a jolted enemy with a melee attack will blind them, and since our melees jolt now, any follow-up punches will also blind. For fragments, actually a lot of them have merit, so I'm going to go over all of them to varying degrees of depth. Spark of Beacons is first up, and with Spark of Beacons on, Arc Special Weapon Final Blows create a blinding explosion. So, blind is actually exactly like disorienting grenades on grenade launchers in that it causes anything short of bosses and champions to be unable to do literally anything except walk around slowly with their head in their arms for a few seconds, and that on its own is really potent in tougher activities. The reason that the wording is different here, that is to say we have blinding as opposed to disorienting, is because Arc Blind that comes from Arc subclasses actually stuns unstoppable champions now. If grenade launchers said that they blinded and they didn't stun unstoppable champions, that would be pretty crap on Bungie's part, so that is why the wording is different now. But yeah, this fragment is really good and can really pretty greatly increase the potency of some of the ad-slaying Arc special weapons that we have in the game. The amount of guns that are really good with this fragment are too numerous to name, but just know that if you want to go with one of those and you're planning on getting a lot of kills with it, it's a good fragment. Spark of Resistance is next, which gives a 10-point boost to strength and grants a 25% damage resistance while within 15 meters of 3 or more enemies. It's a pretty straightforward fragment and has great synergy with many of the Arc Hunter builds, and again, it's all around a strong fragment. Spark of Momentum, sliding over ammo bricks, reloads your equipped weapon and grants 10% melee energy. It's a fine fragment, but it's not going to make the cut more often than not. Spark of Shock, your arc grenades jolt targets, -10 to discipline. And now Spark of Shock is in the running for strongest fragment in the game, right up there with things like Ember of Torches and Echo of Undermining. It's an insanely potent effect that makes every arc grenade feel pretty much like a nuclear bomb. Spark of Ions, defeating a jolted target creates an ionic trace. So we already talked about Jolt, we talked about Amplified, we talked about Blind. Another one that we got to cover here is Ionic Traces. Ionic Traces are little blue lines that aggressively track along the ground back toward the player and grant 12.5% energy to all of your abilities when they reach you. And with how much all of the Arc Hunter builds are jolting things, this fragment can get a ton of value, as its internal cooldown is only a few seconds, so you'll pretty much be proccing it on cooldown. Spark of Discharge. Arc weapon final blows have a chance to create an ionic trace. With this, it really should actually say that every third kill with an arc weapon spawns a trace. In my testing at least, it was quite consistently every third kill, but description aside, it's another potent general use kind of fragment. Spark of Frequency. Melee hits grant 100 reload speed with a 0.8 duration scaler. 100 reload speed with a 0.8 duration scaler is likely to be the fastest reload you've ever experienced, and you can get this effect off of either charged or uncharged melee hits. Now that's cool and all, but I don't know if we really need our reload to be that fast after we're punching things, and we already have Flow State, which gives a pretty hefty reload buff as well, so this is often going to be redundant. Spark of Focus, -10 to mobility, with a 150% class ability regeneration buff after sprinting for a short duration. This buff actually does stack with Flow State's class ability cooldown reduction, and again, we're never taking off that aspect, so while it's certainly useful, it's just overkill in a lot of cases, especially with Combination Blow fully resetting our dodge in most builds, although it can be nice to kind of give you some more assurance. Spark of Recharge. While critically wounded, your melee and grenade energy recharge more quickly. About 400% more quickly, to be exact, which is good. But I personally just fundamentally don't like effects that require me to do something undesirable to use a part of my kit. And I really don't want to be critical HP for long enough for this fragment to get a whole lot of value. That said, it comes up a lot more often than I'd like to admit with how in the fray you need to be for most of these Arc Hunter builds. Spark of Magnitude. Your lingering arc grenades last 33% longer. This will affect lightning, pulse, and storm nades. It's definitely not the worst thing to run if you are using one of those nades, but this one doesn't usually make the cut. Spark of Amplitude. Rapidly defeating targets while you're amplified creates an orb of power. And oh my word, how many orbs you can make on Hunter with this fragment. With Hunter's amplified activation condition being to just kill a jolted target, and the fact that Hunters have a very easy time meeting that criteria, you're amplified all the time. So you're just basically making orbs every time you get a kill, and orbs are really important in the current sandbox. It's a banger fragment. It does have a 10-second internal cooldown, but still, you're going to be activating it on that cooldown every single time. Spark of Feedback. Taking melee damage increases your outgoing melee damage. So pretty simple effect here. It's a 75% buff, which is quite solid. But again, my issue here is the same as with Spark of Recharge. I don't want to have to do a bad thing, get hit by a melee attack, in order to use part of my kit. But again, like Spark of Recharge, the situation does come up quite a bit. Keep in mind with this one, though, that boss stomps actually don't seem to count by my testing. So you're going to need actual physical boss-like swipes to proc its effect. Can be quite good if you're using a combination blow-focused damage strategy or something like that. Spark of Volts. Get 10 recovery out of this one, and finishers will make us amplified. You're not often going to need this, but there is one specific instance where you might use it that we'll talk about later. Spark of Brilliance. Defeating a blinded target with a precision final blow emits a blinding explosion. Spark of Instinct. When critically wounded, taking damage emits a burst of arc energy that jolts targets. And you know what? This is probably my favorite of the oh shit fragments, the fragments that need you to do a bad thing to get use out of them. Synergizes really well with the Hunter playstyle, and it's not a bad little kind of audible spec play if you want, or you just have an extra fragment slot. It's not usually going to be my first choice, but it's a fine one. Spark of Haste is 30 mobility, resilience, and recovery when you're sprinting. So since this is just regular old stats in recup, mobility, and resilience, we can't go above 100. And we're kind of counting on most of those stats to be working all of the time. So we have to basically choose between building into those stats for them to work all the time, or we choose to get value out of the fragment, which I just don't really like. So this one's a pass from me. Now let's get into builds. So with most builds in Destiny, a subclass specific exotic is going to determine most of the choices you make within your build. But Arc Hunter is a bit of a rare case because the exotic that facilitates the strongest Arc Hunter build is actually a class neutral exotic in Assassin's Cowl. So first, for Assassin's Cowl's perk, we have Vanishing Execution, which states that powered melee final blows grant invisibility and restore a portion of your health and shields. Finishers and final blows against more powerful targets increase the duration of the invisibility as well as the amount of health and shields restored, which is an abnormally comprehensive perk description as far as Bungie standards go. So let's just put some numbers on this. Both the health and invisibility duration do, of course, scale up based on the rank of the enemy that you melee killed or finished. Finishers make it even longer, in terms of the invisibility at least. A normal red bar minor gives you 6.8 seconds of invis, 9.8 if you finish it, as well as 100 health instantly. An orange bar elite enemy, or an enemy guardian, will give you 9.8 seconds of invis, or 12.7 off a finisher, as well as 200 health, which is a full heal. Yellow bar mini bosses or champions give again a full heal with a 12.8 or 15.8 second invis. Non-finishable bosses are always 13.3 seconds, since of course you can't finish them, and again get the full heal. This exotic is so insanely broken on hunter subclasses that can easily get melee kills like Gunslinger and Arcstrider. On Arcstrider though, since the playstyle the subclass demands is so perilous, the extra survivability from the invis and the healing is insane. Combination blow is a bit unprecedented in terms of sheer uptime and damage, with the huge caveat that you need to literally run up to something and punch it. There are tools intrinsic to the subclass that help mitigate this issue, but Assassin's Cowl just takes it to a whole other level. So for the build, obviously we're going to pair this with Combination Blow, as well as Gambler's Dodge for the quintessential Arcstrider loop of melee kill, Gambler's Dodge, melee kill, Gambler's Dodge, and so on. Jump is going to be preference. I like triple jump. Grenades is actually a bit of a tricky one. I like Pulse the best for just general usefulness, general destructive power, and we can end up with pretty insane grenade uptime with this build as well. But I also want to give a huge shout out to flashbang nades as something that I've been using most frequently lately. So to reiterate a few things, combo blow stacks 3 times, you need to get a kill with it every 20 seconds to stack it or keep it stacked, does ridiculous damage, and is up pretty much permanently. Our exotic also is facilitating extremely high levels of accessibility to the loop that Combination Blow demands. We also get our AoE explosions after every dodge, and then let's also keep in mind Assassin's Cowl's effect will also apply to our uncharged melees so long as we have at least 1 stack of Combination Blow. And with all this being the case, we've got so much slaying power just built into our melee, and a lot of content, the issue is often more with just keeping Combination Blow stacked up. As, again, without the stacks, it's just a normal melee. And sometimes there just aren't many weak adds around, or your teammates are nabbing all the kills. Sometimes you leave an ad low and the Aftershock ends up killing it, you don't get the stack. Since I think sufficiently hyped up the perks of having it stacked up all the time, what you really want to be doing is maybe not kill that huge group of ads with that pulse grenade, and instead use something like the flashbangs. Instead of killing all of those ads with like a primary, you leave them. In stuff like solo content or particularly ad-dense situations, there are enough ads around to fuel combo blow and warrant the extra slaying power from like a pure damage grenade and pure damage weapons. But, all of this is to say I would definitely give flashbang nades a try. For the super, I default to Gathering Storm personally, and I'd recommend you do the same since Arc Staff ends up being somewhat redundant with how much ad clear we have in our neutral game. For aspects, we're going to go with Flow State and Lethal Current. Like I said, Flow State, in my opinion, is just too strong to leave out of pretty much any build on this subclass, and this one's no exception. Lethal Current is purely a melee augmenting aspect there, so that's a no-brainer for a melee-based build. And with the suite of abilities that we've selected so far, we're going to dodge melee with Combination Blow, which will jolt and blind and make targets explode through Lethal Current. And if the target dies, our dodge is reset from Combo Blow. We're getting amplified through Flow State, which gives us the ability to do the whole thing over again for as long as we can get into range to reset Gambler's Dodge and have something to punch, basically. On top of that, we now have, of course, the Amplified, which gives us meaty handling and reload buffs to our weapons. Makes us pretty much impervious to damage during our dodge animation. And now, a problem you can run into when first learning this build is a bit of an unfortunate thing that happens with Lethal Current's Lightning Aftershock, which I've kind of alluded to a few times. And that is that if the Aftershock gets the final blow on a given ad, our dodge cooldown won't be reset, and we don't get / refresh a stack of combination blow. This sucks to play around at first, to the point where I, and I'm sure a lot of other people, experimented with swapping the aspect out for Tempest Strike. I'm here to tell you that it is more than possible to play around this effect, and definitely worth learning to play around this effect. As you get more comfortable with the build, you'll end up having a heightened awareness, a heightened knowledge of your damage thresholds, and will be able to more easily identify what to do if you end up in a situation where you don't end up with your dodge reset. Assassin's Cowl makes it even easier to play around as well, since the Aftershock may not stack combination blow, but does proc Assassin's Cowl's healing and invis. For fragments, we're going to start with Spark of Resistance, which is always going to be a good choice, and the only fragment I'd say you should always run on a melee-focused build like this one. Spark of Ions is another permanent, or at least near-permanent inclusion, giving us Ionic Traces off of jolted enemy kills, which is, well, it's pretty much always. It does have that short internal cooldown. What I will say about this fragment, though, is while we are getting 100% value out of it, and that we will more than likely be activating its effect on cooldown, we aren't actually benefiting as much from the energy restoration from Ionic Traces. That's because our dodge and melee are, hopefully at least, being looped infinitely. So it's basically just 12.5% grenade energy every few seconds, and that's still really good, but maybe not as good as it initially sounded. From there, I'd say Spark of Amplitude is going to be a pretty easy inclusion, especially when playing with a team, since we'll be amplified pretty much always, and therefore making orbs pretty much always with this aspect, and that'll help drive our teammates' builds as well as our own. Spark of Shock, I stated earlier, was not only one of the strongest arc fragments in the game, but just one of the strongest fragments in the game, period, because it turns our grenades into nukes. So it'd be crazy not to run a fragment like that, right? And, you know, honestly, I don't think it's that crazy to not run a fragment like that in this build. Because, you see, do we really need or even want nuclear bomb grenades when we are so heavily incentivized to stack up combination blow, our nuclear bomb melee that basically has no cooldown? In some content, I think it's definitely a great choice. Solo content, or particularly high ad density sort of encounters or activities, you're still going to get tons of value out of the grenades. And with how this build is already just functional through only the dodge, we don't really need to run any other fragments in place of this one, so it's not like you're really losing anything else major for it. Overall, I would say go for Spark of Shock if you aren't going the Flashbang Grenade route, but if you are going the Flashbang Grenade route, I would say you can leave this one out. From there, you may be done selecting fragments already, or you may have an extra slot, and there are a lot of fine choices for filling that last slot, so let's list those real quick. Spark of Discharge, again, every third weapon kill makes an Ionic Trace. Same issue as before with traces, they're good, but we're getting slightly diminished value here because our dodge and melee are always up. And then Discharge as well demands that you're getting weapon kills fairly frequently, which do happen, but you don't want to be giving up kills that you could have gotten with combo blow in favor of getting them with a weapon. Spark of Focus, sprinting gives better dodge regen. It's pretty solid. Your combo is going to break every now and then, and this can help you get your dodge back to restart the loop. Spark of Feedback, 75% melee damage buff after being meleeed. Again, you're not going to need the extra damage in moment-to-moment gameplay. This effect isn't really going to come up that much in moment-to-moment gameplay, much less be needed. It can be nice in certain encounters where you can do boss damage through combination blow. Galron from Duality is a good example of this. Spark of Instinct, jolt explosions when your shields break. It's pretty good, pretty solid, random, little useful last slot filler if you want. Spark of Haste for the plus 32 mobility, resil, and recovery when you're sprinting. This can definitely be a pretty nice one if your armor's a little lacking, for example. Spark of Volts, finishers make you amplified, and again, we're going to get to a particular use case that I really like for this one when we get into the armor mods. We're going to start with armor stats first, though. Particularly the top 3 stats of mobility, resilience, and recovery. We want a lot of all 3 of these stats, ideally 100 in fact, but this will actually be quite a bit more achievable than you might think because there is a ton of hidden mobility in this build. Amplified is giving us 50 mobility, so now we only need to get 50 mobility from our armor since we're amplified pretty much always. If you're running a lightweight weapon, you get 20 mobility when you have that weapon out, so now you only need 30 if you just have both of those things. You could also, or instead, run a mobility font on your boots for another 30. Or you could run Spark of Haste for 30 mobility while you're sprinting. And, you know, if you were to do all of these things, obviously that's a lot more than 100 mobility, but if you pick and choose just one of these things, your mobility requirements drop all the way down to somewhere in the 20 to 30 neighborhood. So definitely get to that point and then just try to not waste any if at all possible. From there, we definitely want to max out our resilience. That's going to be priority number 1 because we're in the fray pretty much always. And then secondarily, you can get your recovery up as high as possible as well. And now out of the next 3 stats, strength ends up not being needed because we have our dodge resetting combination blow. And while yes, ideally combination blow is being reset by our dodge cooldown and vice versa always, this combo does break sometimes. The amount of free mobility we get, however, makes hitting a high mobility stat and therefore a short dodge cooldown much less of an investment, coupled with the fact that combination blow does have a slightly longer base cooldown than Gambler's Dodge does. Intellect is unfortunately just not a very good stat, as we have many much more potent ways of generating super energy, so that just leaves discipline. And I'd aim to get 100 discipline, even if it is really just because you can. And now modding out our armor is going to start with the relevant stat mods all around. On the helmet, we're slotting at least 1 hands-on for the insane amount of value it gets in a build centered around melee kills. And more often than not, you'll just run a second one. If you want something a little more well-balanced, though, we can always go for siphon mods corresponding to the weapon you're most likely to be getting rapid kills with. We can also go for heavy ammo finder and or scout at that point, or special ammo finder and or scout. Keep in mind these mods only work on weapon kills and work considerably better on primary weapon kills, so if you're not doing that, then don't bother, just go for the hands-on. For our arm slot, heavy-handed is of course a no-brainer. We're going to get an orb on every melee kill. Then we're going to pair that with impact induction to produce grenade energy every time we punch something. Another super good one. Everything else on the arm slot ends up being kind of redundant. We don't need loaders or dexterity mods because of the huge boosts that we're getting from amplified and flow state. We don't need any additional class ability or melee regen since we have our perpetual loop going. So just put on heavy-handed and then fill the rest of the slots up with impact induction mods. For our chest here, triple resist mods are going to be my recommendation since of course you'll be taking a lot of shots with this build, and being that extra bit more tanky is going to help a lot. For our leg armor, the choice here is to either run surges or not run surges. If you're in a boss damage encounter, it's probably a good idea to just run 3 surges matching the weapon you're using for DPS. If you're in an activity where there are enough adds around to warrant the use of an ad clear weapon while still having enough adds to keep combo blow going, running surges to match that gun can also be fine. Otherwise, I would recommend just going for innervation for grenade energy, as well as, or instead of better already, or recuperation for a little bit of extra healing. For our cloak, our choices here can vary quite a bit, but a staple is going to be at least 1 bomber if you can fit it. Since we're spamming the crap out of our dodge, we're going to get insane value out of that mod. If you are running surges, time dilation is a great choice. Reaper is really good if you're regularly getting weapon kills. And special finisher has been my default as of late, since there's not often a need to run anything else, and I can keep a double special loadout topped off much more easily with the mod. This is that situation I was talking about where the Spark of Volts fragment might see some value, especially when considering we're combining that with Assassin's Cowl's Invis and Heal off of finishers. On to weapons here now. You'd be pretty crazy not to run a 1-2 punch shotgun with any build centered around combination blow. If you're running an ad clear weapon, that'll be best used from your energy slot and having it be arc, of course. So that'll mean your shotgun's probably going in your kinetic slot in such a case. For kinetic options, we have the Wastelander from Dares, which can get 1-2 punch and is a lightweight frame for the extra mobility bonus. We also have the Ragenhild, which is craftable and gets auto-loading holster with 1-2 punch. If you are running a shotgun in the energy slot though, and opting for double special or something like that, which is something I often do, my favorite is the Xenoclast from Vanguard, which is arc and gets Grave Robber with 1-2 punch. Any shotgun with 1-2 punch is going to do just fine, but those are kind of my favorites. For your other weapon, you have so many options, especially if the activity you're playing warrants extra ad clear. A blinding grenade launcher or a sniper rifle paired with my shotgun is kind of my default, something like Pardon or Dust or Succession. But if we're allowed to go for ad clear, we've got Trinity Ghoul, Risk Runner, Ikelos with Volt Shot. All of these guns are bananas. We've got Tarnished Metal with Demo Volt Shot, which is another consistent option you can add some range to your arsenal with. We've got Brigand's Law with Volt Shot, Iterative Loop with Volt Shot, Plug 1 with Reservoir Burst, Forbearance, Salvager Salvo, Insidious, Posterity, Come to Pass, Long Arm, Sweet Sorrow, Trespasser, and my personal favorite, the Out of Bounds from the Crucible. On top of it being a lightweight frame, the role of Grave Robber with Golden Tricorn was literally made for this build. Grave Robber is going to reload your gun after every melee kill, which is also easy Golden Tricorn procs through Combination Blow, and this thing will rip with Golden Tricorn fully stacked up and the gun constantly reloading off of Grave Robber. It just fits into the loop so nicely, so long as you have enough adds to actually get value out of Golden Tricorn, and enough to keep Combination Blow stacked up. As exciting as all of this is, almost always my recommendation is to just not run an ad clearing primary, and you may even be doing yourself a disservice by running one and actually trying to use it, since you won't be able to stack combo blows easily. I change this build up constantly depending on the activity, which is why I've given so many kind of options as we've gone through this. My default choices for mods are double hands-on on my helmet, double impact induction, and heavy-handed on gloves, triple resists on the chest, one of innervation, better already, and recuperation on my legs, and then double bomber with special finisher on my class item. Then we're rocking Succession and Xenoclast. I'll have a dim link for this one in the description. Up next for exotics is Liar's Handshake, which is the exotic that has largely been synonymous with Arcstrider in PvE since it came out back in year 2. Receiving or dealing melee damage grants cross counter for 3 seconds, which will deal an additional 200% melee damage or 80% when combined with 1-2 punch. These punches with cross counter on also heal you. So this exotic is really only helpful with follow-up punches actually, or punches after you've been punched, which isn't that often. This healing being only tied to punching something with the perk up as well as the extra damage do make this exotic the easy choice for when you're using a combo blow focused damage strategy, since you won't be able to kill a boss that you're punching repeatedly to proc healing consistently. So now this exotic, of course, is going to mandate a build entirely focused around Combination Blow again, and as such, we're basically just copying and pasting all of the choices and caveats from the previous Assassin's Cowl build, and it'll function largely the same. And you know what? That's honestly kind of the case with most of the Arcstrider builds. The Combination Blow build it's just baked into the subclass, so you can use it regardless of what exotic you're running, and it'll probably just be the best thing to run. Star Eater Scales is a great option, seeing as how the super does very good boss damage. So again, you can literally just copy and paste the build onto Star Eaters. Stompies is a favorite of most Hunter players. You can just copy and paste the build there. Frosties, I mean, anything really. Even Wormhusk Crown could function as essentially like Assassin's Cowl Light with all the dodges you're getting. And this ideology extends even to the other Arcstrider specific exotics like Blight Ranger, Lucky Raspberry. And well, you know, I initially prepared a fully against the grain build, running some weird stuff, and it felt better than I was expecting, but realistically in PvE, you are always doing yourself a disservice by not equipping Flow State, Lethal Current, Combination Blow, and Gambler's Dodge. The other options of Marksman's Dodge, Disorienting Blow, and Tempest Strike are basically only here for PvP, and even though I'd love to tell you that there's a great build in there somewhere that I was first to find and make a video on, there just isn't. You're always doing Combo Blow, Gambler's Dodge, Lethal Current, and Flow State unless you are making a conscious decision to nerf yourself. The question really is how much or how little you want to lean into the Combination Blow melee playstyle. Leaning into it as much as possible is almost always going to yield the best results, and when I say leaning into it, that means giving up other sources of slaying power so as not to reduce your supply of fuel for Combination Blow stacks. So running things like flashbang nades, running utility weapons instead of ad slaying weapons, stuff like that. The amount of instances where you have enough around to kill to maintain and get high value out of good Combination Blow uptime, as well as a damage grenade and an ad clear weapon, just do not come up very frequently. But Flow State's weapon improvements and things like Spark of Beacons are definitely good enough to warrant leaning into, even if maybe it isn't as good overall. There might be certain situations where it is better. A huge plus side to builds that don't lead on combination blow as hard is that they can add clear faster potentially than a hard combo blow build will in activities where the only thing you need to do is clear a ton of squishy trash really quickly. Some examples that come to mind are, normal mode Raiden counters with a heavy emphasis on movement, like Shirochi, Exhibition, Queen's Walk, encounters where you're really just wasting time dancing around getting combo blow stacks and meleeing things when you could just shoot one for Baron's shot or one Trinity Ghoul shot and wipe the entire room. You can still run combination blow and Gambler's Dodge. In fact, you should still run combination blow and Gambler's Dodge, but it's just a backup in this case. So you throw on Spark of Shock and Spark of Beacons, those two fragments in there, and go to town with something like Forbearance or Trinity Ghoul. And this build feels really, really good in those activities. You could just as easily run Assassin's Cowl with this build too, but an exotic I'd recommend you try out that I was very pleasantly surprised by in my testing is actually Shinobu's Vow. Shinobu's Vow gives you a second skip grenade charge. Your skip grenades spawn an additional projectile. The projectiles track more aggressively toward opponents and refund 10% grenade energy on each projectile hit, which with that extra projectile is up to 50%, up to half of your grenade back on every throw. For a build with Shinobu's Vow, obviously, we're going to go for skip grenade. With the build that I had just finished outlining. For fragments, we're going Spark of Shock, Ions, Amplitude, and either Resistance or Beacons for that last slot, depending on whether you're using a primary arc weapon or a special arc weapon. On the armor, same rules for mobility apply as with the Assassin's Cowl build. Try not to go above 50 so as not to waste the bonus from Amplified, which you'll have most of the time. You'll usually only have to run 20 or 30, depending on what other mobility sources you may have. From there, we'd like to get to 100 resilience, first and foremost, then 100 discipline, and then anything extra is best put towards recovery. For mods, we're going for an Arc Siphon mod on the helmet for sure, and from there are really no wrong answers, with Ashes to Assets getting some bolstered effectiveness thanks to Shinobu's Vow's grenade spam. Finders and Scouts are just generally quite strong, and hands-on is always a good choice with combination blow in the build. On the arms, impact induction is still going to be a must include, along with one or both of firepower and heavy-handed. For chests, your choice of resist mods are standard, and then for legs, we're going to go for a couple of arc surges, as well as either a recuperation, better already, or innervation if you can fit one. Devoting our armor charge to grenade kickstart might seem like a good call here for a build using a potent grenade exotic like Shinobu's Vow, but we're going to opt for surges here instead, and here's why. Firstly, per the description of the mod at least, grenade kickstart and kickstart mods in general should not work with abilities with multiple charges like our skip grenades in this case. This is because the mod description reads that your energy on your ability must be fully expended. Since we have that second charge, we need to be either at exactly one charge and then throw our grenade, or have two charges and throw them both consecutively to actually have fully expended grenade energy. Now, I believe Bungie has stated that they do intend for these mods to work for abilities with multiple charges, but they have and have not worked in the past and may or may not work in the future, depending on when you're watching this. Second reason is that I think surges are just a much more efficient investment. 22% weapon damage with such an easy activation and high uptime is really strong. And if you went the kickstart route, kickstarts are really only worth running if you run multiple copies of the kickstart, as well as a mod like Charged Up, or even multiple Charged Up mods, and you have the kickstart mods monopolize all of your armor charge. So, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer choice to me, and the common mods, Ionic Traces, and our exotic will put in plenty of work to bolster our grenade uptime. Finally, for the class item, we're going to go for a Bomber mod, a Time Dilation mod, and a Reaper mod. For weapons, since this build is for the most part focused around gunplay, the better your weapons are, the more they'll shine on this build. We do have Shinobu's Vow here as well, so perks like Demolitionist, Golden Tricorn, and Adrenaline Junkie are going to work well. That said though, this build is much more about the subclass bolstering our weapons and not the other way around. So weapons with perks that plainly increase the output of the weapon are going to yield the highest returns as far as legendary weapon kind of rolls are concerned. Exotic weapons with huge slaying potential like Risk Runner, Trinity Ghoul, Those are going to feel fantastic. Legendaries like Forbearance with Chain Reaction, Path of Least Resistance with Volt Shot, those are going to feel the best, especially when paired with Spark of Beacons. And I've already named tons of guns in this video, and all the guns that I have named so far will work really, really well in this build, since, of course, it's all about bolstering guns, but, you know, pay special attention to anything with Volt Shot for sure. We've got a dim link for this one in the description if you are so inclined. Kind of way you could change this if you wanted is you could go for Lucky Raspberry, just run the same build but with Arc Bolt grenades. And then again with this one, you could put any of the Hunter neutral exotics on here too, like Stompies. That's probably my favorite way to run it. Nothing better than running through Shirochi with Stompies on and Forbearance, just spam killing everything, making the whole room blind. It's a lot of fun. So now to talk really briefly about the 3 different exotics for the Arc Staff Super. You do get some decent damage out of Arc Staff if you do the 2 light attacks into a heavy attack combo, and you can do this nifty little trick where you pop Arc Staff with a stacked Star Eater scales on, and then swap to one of the Arc Staff exotics, and you'll keep the damage bonus from Star Eaters. Out of these 3 Arc Staff exotics, Raiden Flux is the best, both for this little tech and just in general, and it has been that way since it came out back in year 1. It just bolsters the super very consistently and immensely in all the ways that you want, those being damage and duration. Raiju's Harness is more about having your Arc Staff up more often, since you can deactivate it early with Raiju's on to refund energy, and additionally you lose super energy half as fast while you're blocking with it on. Blight Ranger is the final Arc Staff specific exotic, which also bolsters the blocking feature of the super. Projectiles reflected by the block deals 650% increased damage when reflected, and blocking projectiles creates orbs for your allies, so it's kind of like a little mini Ursa Furiosa in that way. So if you really want to use Arc Staff, these are the exotics that I would consider maybe swapping to when you want to pop your super, and not much else. Their effects are not strong enough, and Arc Staff isn't good enough to warrant running them in activities where your equipment is locked or anything like that, which would make the swap impossible. On top of that, Gathering Storm is really good. And in fact, in tighter spaces, it's pretty much going to cover the same amount of area that you could if you were running around with your Arc Staff out. But at any rate, if you really want to run them, you just super love the way they look or something like that, either of the 2 prototype kind of builds that I outlined will work for you. Just take either of the dim links and then just swap out the exotic for one of these. So at the end of the day, we've really only got 2 builds here. And as such, I think you can kind of think of Arcstrider builds as existing on a spectrum, with one end of the spectrum being leaning all the way into combination blow, and the other being leaning all the way into weapons and grenades and stuff. Both ends of the spectrum have merit. Everywhere in the middle on the spectrum has merit. But in some activities, there are even enough ads around to lean into both, really. And that's where the build feels its best, for sure. But if you have to pick one, leaning into combo blow all the way is generally the strongest option, and that's, you know, going to be along the lines of the Assassin's Cowl build we talked about first, where you take a 1-2 punch shotgun, a utility weapon in the other slot, and the flashbang grenade. As you move across the spectrum, you might swap Assassin's Cowl out for a different exotic. A little further, you might put on an ad-slaying arc weapon. A little further still, you might throw on Spark of Shock and a damage grenade like Pulse Nades. And then even further, you throw on Forbearance and Spark of Beacons, and at that point, your weapon is bolstered to the point where it just is the build. It just is the subclass. So what you can kind of do with this knowledge is, depending on what activity you're doing, what kind of playstyle you want to go for, you can just kind of move this kind of imaginary slider back and forth and see what feels right for you and for the activity. But that's going to do it for this video, for this Arcstrider guide. We're going to have more guides coming out on the channel soon. More weapon guides, more all kinds of stuff. That'll be coming out every Friday and Sunday, so make sure you subscribe, leave a like on the video and a comment. And I appreciate you all for sticking around this long, and I hope to see you in the next one.